Is there any one in particular that we're seeing right now that is happening all the time?
It's not a new fraud, and that's check fraud.
Checks?
Yeah,
People still use those?
We're still using
Okay.
checks. We're still using checks.
Well, we're excited to talk about fraud.
Yay, fraud again.
And scammers and all the things. I guess this is a topic that's really never going away.
Yeah, no, this is an evergreen topic. And, frequently I get asked, well, it's job security, right? Because the fraud's always here. And I was, and I finally realized, I told this to someone, I was like, I think probably myself and everyone on my team, we would happily find another career if it meant that we lived in an honest world. But unfortunately, that doesn't seem like that's not going to happen anytime soon.
So from your perspective, what is it that makes scammers, right, the ones behind the fraud, what makes them so successful? Why are they able to, quote unquote, trick us?
Well, I think the main thing that makes scammers most successful is that they're very, very good at manipulating emotions. Whether that's positive emotions like I've got a job, or I've just won the lottery, or negative emotions like you're being investigated for a crime, or there's a problem, or your account's been compromised. And so that's I think the thing that really that they really hook into and makes them so successful, because when you have that ability to manipulate emotions so well, which, let's be fair, scammers aren't the only ones that are doing it. You go and you watch movies and they're trying to elicit a certain type of response, right? We're getting into the political season, and there's all kinds of emotional manipulation going on there, but just the lack of ethics and the lack of scruples, is you combine that with this ability to manipulate people, and it's a recipe for heartache and loss, and certainly for those that fall victim to it.
Yeah, so they understand what emotions to play off for us.
What strings to pull.
Yeah. Is there any particular type of fraud? Obviously, we've talked about all the different types of fraud on this podcast before. Is there any one in particular that we're seeing right now that is happening all the time?
Yeah, so the one it kind of falls into that oldie but goodie. It's not a new fraud. It's just showing a resurgence lately, and that's check fraud.
Really?
Yeah.
Checks?
Yeah.
People still use those?
We're still using checks. We're still using checks. We're still writing a piece of paper. Yeah, it's a crazy thing, and it's kind of one of those things. People like to get paid quickly.
Yeah.
But they don't like to pay others quickly. And that's kind of the beauty of the check, right? Is that you can say the check's in the mail, and it is in the mail, but it doesn't come out of your account for a couple of days. And so that's that ability to kind of, that float time between the time you write a check and the check time it actually clears, that's something that can be innocent, but it can also be exploited. And that's where fraudsters, kind of find, again, that opportunity to exploit.
Okay.
And, industry-wide check fraud is up like 87% year over year.
No kidding.
It's really being facilitated by mail theft.
Okay.
So, whether you're expecting a check or you're sending a check, if it comes in the mail, that's a prime opportunity for it to be intercepted by someone who it doesn't belong to.
Yeah.
And we've seen situations, there's been reports of mail carriers actually being robbed at gunpoint for their keys, because their keys get them access to these communal mailboxes at apartment buildings and like some of the planned unit developments where they have, the big boxes with lots of mailboxes in it, and so they can get access to that, and then now they've got access to 20 or 30 mailboxes. There's unfortunately been some instances of postal workers that are stealing mail. And so it's a real, right now it's a real weak point in the kind of overall ecosystem that's being exploited.
Okay.
So that's one of the things that's really kind of feeding this resurgence of this really kind of legacy, scam or, legacy fraud. The other thing I think that's also influencing this is there's so much technology that we can bring to bear in terms of identifying fraud in digital channels, and that's, I think, kind of, as we've said before, fraud doesn't go away. It's like a balloon. You squeeze the balloon and the air doesn't go out of the balloon. It just goes somewhere else in the balloon, and that's
Right.
what's happening here. And so as we're applying more pressure and squeezing on like these digital and tech channels, right, the fraud is kind of migrating now back to these more analog channels, and you really don't get more analog than a check.
Right. So from a fraud perspective, would you say abandon checks?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
Okay.
there are much, much better ways. And as a consumer, there are much, much more beneficial ways to move money than to send a check to someone.
Okay.
When you write a check to someone, you're basically giving them all the information that they need to access your account. Let alone you're giving them your name and your address and your signature, but they're getting your routing number, your account number, and that's so easy to exploit. So there are much better ways than to write a check, and certainly much better ways than to mail a check.
Okay.
So using things like credit cards, debit cards, all of the major credit and debit card brands have great protections, not just against fraud, but against what would be the right word? An unethical business. So,
Right.
for example, if you want to, I just got new gutters on my home. Right?
Wonderful. How
Right.
exciting.
So,
yeah.
And expensive, right?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
Everything
Yeah.
with a house is expensive, it seems like. But, back in the day, someone would come and you'd write them a check. They do the work, and if the work is done, and you write them a check. Well, I've now handed this person all the information that they need to compromise my account, as I said before. Well, if you give that person a down payment, or heaven forbid, you pay them in advance and they never do the work, your options with a check are very, very limited. You're pretty much looking at something like small claims court, which in and of itself is time consuming and a hassle and expensive.
Right.
And it's going to be weeks and months and maybe years before you get your money back. That same scenario, like when I bought my gutters, I used my credit card. They kind of put it into escrow, so to speak, and then they were able to authorize it. They knew I had the money. They knew that they were going to get paid, but I didn't authorize the charge until they were done and completed with the work. Now, if they hadn't done the work, or if they had done, maybe they had said that they were going to do one thing and they did something else, there's much, much more recourse that I have with a debit card or a credit card than there is with a check.
Okay, so just as a best practice and
Yeah.
how you're transacting and which tools to use in
Yeah.
moving your money.
Yeah.
Maybe checks aren't not only the safest, also not the most efficient.
No,
Yeah.
when you really boil it down to brass tacks, a check is really a glorified IOU.
Yeah.
That's all it is. You're
fair.
basically saying, I owe you this money. And so it's really antiquated, but if it seems like in our society we really like to adopt new technologies, but some of these old technologies we really just have this death grip on, and checks is one of those.
Yeah. So Rob, when we're talking about checks, obviously having that physical paper in my hand that can be taken out of the mail and washed and repurposed
Right.
makes sense.
Yep.
But talk to me about electronic checks, because that's a different tool.
So you can imagine that if you're a brick and mortar retailer, if you accept checks, that's a hassle to process.
Yeah.
So when you are writing a check, a lot of times what a brick and mortar store will do is they'll convert that into an electronic check or an electronic transaction. That's much easier for them, and quite frankly, it's safer for you, right?
Okay.
Now, if we're talking about someone paying you by an electronic check,
Okay.
right? Then, or they're asking, you're maybe over the phone and they're asking you to pay them over the phone. That can be a different situation, because now, number one, you don't know who you're talking to if they called you, like a solicitor.
Right.
And number two, if somebody tries to pay you with an electronic check and they, for example, email you a copy of a check, that's red flags should go off on that, because that's not how checks are processed.
Okay.
So if someone emails you an electronic copy of a check and says, hey, deposit this in your financial institution using a remote deposit or a mobile deposit, yeah, that's not legitimate, and that's not a legitimate way to negotiate a check.
Okay. But then if I'm writing a check, handing it to my brick and mortar store, and they scan it and hand it right back to me?
Yeah. They're just converting it to electronic, and it's easier for them because they don't have this paper that they need to handle, and it's more secure for you.
Okay. Yeah. So I might as well just use a card.
Right. Yeah. Well, because again, and that's a great point, Kristalina, because again, in a brick and mortar store, if you pay by check and then, let's say, for example, you get whatever you bought home and it's broken, or it's not what you ordered, or you want to return it, you've got a lot more options with a debit card or a credit card than you do with a check.
Okay, fair. And so that's why we're seeing that increase in fraud.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting. Okay, so we're abandoning checks. So obviously, if not checks, the best way to pay, we've talked about using a debit card, a credit card.
Right.
Any other things we need to be aware of?
You want to be very careful and explore your options and understand the risks associated with each payment method. Yeah. You could certainly do something like a person-to-person transfer.
Sure.
That may be an option in some circumstances, but you want to be careful about understanding some of the risks and pitfalls of that, because there are some.
Yeah.
We see people being taken advantage of in those platforms, usually in situations of where, say, someone's selling something online, a puppy, a computer, something like that, and they say, oh, send me money through X platform. You send the money and then you never see the product.
Yeah.
And because you authorize the transaction, many of those networks will not reimburse you for that transaction because it was authorized. Whereas if it was an unauthorized transaction, then they would reimburse you. So be very careful about understanding the pros and the cons about any method that you choose based on the circumstances. Because going back to the person-to-person payment method, if I were at, say, a farmer's market, and I'm buying a fresh produce or a case of oranges or something like that, I'm taking those oranges with me right then. So, there's no danger of, well, I'm not going to get my oranges because I'm walking away with my oranges. In that type of a situation, a person-to-person payment, I really don't see a lot of risk in that type of a situation.
Okay, awesome. So just understanding what your tools are and what the ramifications of using them might be.
And that's where I would go, and that's where, from the perspective of Mountain America, we want to help guide our members forward. And so, come and talk to us so that we can help you understand the pros and the cons of all of those payment methods.
Okay, perfect. And then just to reiterate, don't mail a check.
Yes, mailing a check, especially if you're just putting it out in your mailbox and putting up the flag, not a good idea. If you absolutely, positively need to mail a check and there is no other option, don't put it in your mailbox. Don't even drop it in a blue mailbox, because the keys to those blue mailboxes are common. You get a key to one, you've got a key to them all, and we've even seen instances where fraudsters will just hook up a big truck to a blue mailbox and they'll just yank it out of the ground and drive off with it. So don't put it in your mailbox. Don't put it in the blue mailbox. Take it inside the post office and mail it from inside the post office. You could, depending on the circumstances or the level of concern that you have about that, certainly you could send it certified mail. You could send it UPS, FedEx. You have many options available to you.
Okay, if you have to.
If you have to.
If you have to.
Reference prior comments about other options.
Yeah. So what about businesses, right? Like, speaking of your rain gutter business, they're not able to take a credit card. Of course, they want a check, right? Or some of these other smaller businesses that are maybe interacting with checks a lot more often.
Sure.
What are some of the options for them?
So that's where I would probably recommend that you visit one of our business account executives and our business services team at Mountain America, because they could really provide you a lot of options, not only in terms of writing checks and accepting checks, but how to process those checks, because that can be a time-consuming process as well. And there's some products that we have available to help out and to facilitate that. Now, in terms of, we have to look at both sides of the coin, because so you're writing checks and you're also receiving checks. So when you're talking about a business that's writing checks, right? So that's the thing to be concerned about, because they have to now, okay, are they going to go to the post office every time they need to send a check? And there's some other considerations there. So some of the tools that we have available and that are commonly available for businesses that are writing checks is something called positive pay. Okay. And what that allows a business to do is basically have a log of the checks that they've written, so that and so they're basically informing their financial institution, these are the checks that I've written, this is the check number, this is the amount, this is the payee, so that when that check comes to be posted to their account, it's matched against that list.
Oh, nice.
And then if it doesn't match the list, then it's rejected.
Okay.
And there's a few different variations of that. But that's the general gist of how that works. So positive pay is something that I would highly recommend for any business account, because it's a great way to protect them from having their checks stolen and then either altered or counterfeited or something like that.
Right, because check washing is still happening.
Check washing is still happening. Speaking of going back to analog channels, this is check washing. Just straight out counterfeit checks. So they'll take the information off of the bottom of the check, and then they'll use it to make a completely counterfeit check that maybe doesn't even have that business's name on it. So.
Oh, okay. All right. So still lots of options if for some reason checks are in our life.
Yeah,
right?
and very affordable options, and options that significantly reduce the risk.
Okay. Any other tips that we need to stay safe when it comes to not just using checks, but let's just say fraud in general too?
So just general fraud prevention tips. It's always best to monitor your account frequently.
Okay.
And, I would say at least weekly, if not more frequently. And there's so many options available now with apps and with transaction alerts. It's very, very easy to keep an eye on your account, so I recommend that highly. Another thing, monitoring your credit report on a regular basis. You don't need to do that quite as frequently as you do for your transactions on your financial institution's accounts. And one more thing that I'll say about your financial institution accounts, make sure you're monitoring accounts that you don't use frequently.
Oh, okay.
That's something that you should probably even monitor more frequently than the account that you're using. Because sometimes we hear that, I don't use this account and I didn't realize that money had been taken out of my account until months and months and months later. Whereas if they would have reported it in a more timely fashion, there would have been a lot more options. So as a consumer, your liability for an unauthorized transaction is weighted heavily on how quickly you report that. So if you wait, months to report an unauthorized transaction, that can be detrimental. So in addition to monitoring accounts that you use, monitor accounts that you don't use. That's even more important.
Okay.
Monitoring credit reports, and then your usual things. Make sure that you're not reusing your passwords. Make sure that you're keeping them secure, that you're not writing them down. Also, I would say a good security tip would be to be careful about what you're sharing on social media.
Okay.
Because that can be mined for information that can be exploited in scams, particularly against maybe elderly in terms of leveraging their family relations. So the classic kind of grandma scam that we've, I think, talked about before on the podcast, where grandparent gets a phone call from somebody who claims to be, a grandchild, and that they're in trouble and that they need help and they need money, but don't tell mom and dad. I don't want them to worry, that type of a thing. And so when you're sharing a lot of information on social media publicly, as opposed to just to your circle of friends, that can be something that can be exploited. So be very cautious about what you're sharing on social media publicly about your life, about your family, about where you're traveling, and those sorts of things.
Okay, awesome. All really good advice. So, Rob, any parting thoughts? We've gone through kind of a checklist of things that we want to do, like check our accounts frequently, maybe not do, like use checks as much as possible or don't use checks as much as possible. And then also, be wary of answering the phone to people that you don't know. And obviously, huge red flag if people are trying to get information from you. Yes.
All of those things are the great things to focus on. And if there's questions or there's situations that maybe don't exactly match with what we've talked about, but maybe are similar, really just take advantage of the resources that you have available to you. Come and talk to us, call us, visit one of our branches, give us the opportunity to help guide you forward, because that's what we're here for.
Yeah. And speaking of guiding you forward, and our podcast name, thank you, Rob, for the plug. And thank you for joining us and always sharing all of your knowledge as well.
Thank you for having me, Christelina.
Yeah. And thanks to all of you for tuning in, and we will see you on the next episode of Guiding You Forward.